The story goes that when Ernest Shackleton was trying to recruit volunteers for his Antarctic mission, he put the following ad in a newspaper: "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in the event of success." Now, while we might expect such an ad to generate very limited interest, paradoxically, it seems that they were flooded with volunteers. Lots of people saw that and said, "Sign me up." People don't naturally want to sacrifice themselves unless the thing that they are sacrificing themselves for is important. Then they can rise up and choose to make those kinds of sacrifices. Today, I want to look at a story in which Jesus says that the people who follow after him are going to have to make costly sacrifices to do something that is very important. So read with me in Luke chapter 14, verse 25 to 33. A large crowd was following Jesus. He turned around and said to them, "If you want to be my disciple, you must by comparison hate everyone else. Your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. But don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money. And then everyone would laugh at you. They would say, 'There's the person who started that building but couldn't afford to finish it.' Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against him? And if he can't, he will send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while his enemy is still far away. So you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own." Often when we talk about faith, we want to make it seem as appealing as possible. This sort of culminated in the seeker-sensitive movement of the 80s and 90s. We wanted to lower the barriers of entry for people coming to church, but perhaps in the process, we didn't serve them well. If a couple came to me and requested premarital counseling, and I sat them down and simply told them about all of the joys and wonders of being married, but never mentioned the sacrifices, the difficulties, the challenges, I wouldn't be doing them a proper service. Because when they get married, they're going to encounter some of those difficulties, and if they haven't been warned in advance, they're not going to be prepared for them. And so it is sometimes we bring in disciples, and we tell them about all the wonderful things about Jesus, but we never prepare them for the kind of difficulties that lay along the way of following Jesus. Jesus wants disciples, of course, but he doesn't want them on dishonest terms, so he tells them the truth. He doesn't sugarcoat it, because he knows that a lot of the people that are following him aren't following him for the right reason. Notice the story says that a large crowd was following Jesus. Seldom is the crowd going in the right direction. Seldom does the crowd have the right set of motives. You see, this crowd is hoping to ride Jesus' coattails to victory, military victory, over the Roman occupying forces, where they will see him inaugurate God's glorious earthly kingdom. But that's not the mission that Jesus is trying to accomplish in the world. Instead, Jesus is setting up a heavenly kingdom. He's calling into existence a new group of people, not Israelites, but a group that transcends all of those boundaries. Those people are meant to live a kind of life that demonstrates, as a sort of proof of concept, the wisdom of God expressed in Jesus. Because if those people live together as Jesus lived, the world will see the wisdom of God demonstrated by the life that they have. They'll see and be jealous and say, "Where do I sign up?" But if Jesus lowers his demands and says, "You don't have to give up things. You don't have to be any different than you were before," the church will look exactly the same as the people who surround it. And then why would anybody join the church? They could just join the Kiwanis Club or the Rotary Club. It just becomes a way of making connections and getting out of the house on Sunday morning. So Jesus makes high demands of them. In Jesus' culture, family obligations trumped all things. If you were an adult, you still had to answer to your father or your grandfather, whoever the oldest living relative was in your family. They were the patriarch. They could tell you who to marry, what job to work, where to live. In our own culture, we like our family and everything, but if parents are telling their grown children whom they can marry and where they can live, we would consider that extremely meddlesome. Jesus isn't being anti-family. What he's trying to say is that the places that have the greatest say in our lives have to come second even to him. And so if Jesus were giving this same speech to people in our cultural context, he'd probably use some different examples. He would talk about how the certain things that we hold as our highest allegiances need to bend the knee to him. So what might some of those allegiances be? Well, some examples. First, patriotism. Of course, this is a more of a thing that they talk about south of the border than here. But patriotism is essentially the call of the community on the individual. And in some sense, patriotism is entirely consistent with Christianity. After all, we are supposed to love our neighbor, so we are supposed to be about the benefit of the community where we're situated. But at the same time, when the community makes demands of us that are inconsistent with the demands that Jesus makes, then the demands of the community must be subordinate. And so if our community says you need to treat people right, Jesus says, great. But if our community says we're going to war, we need you to kill our enemies, we say, well, I'm sorry, but Jesus says I'm supposed to love my enemies, so I can't go there and do what you're asking. Jesus comes first. Another example of one of the allegiances that we hold is to our personal freedom. It's one of the things that we're most willing to fight for. Personal freedom or personal autonomy is really the right to do whatever I want when I want to do it. But if I follow Jesus, if I make him Lord of my life, then I have to yield to Jesus. I have to allow him, not my own will, to ultimately decide where I go, what I do, and how I do it. Another example might be prosperity. We're trained by our culture to believe that the good life is a life that is well supplied, that enjoys the good things, i.e. material possessions, and finds security by having sufficient material possessions. But what if Jesus calls us not to have enough laid up that we feel secure? If he calls us to this sort of life of insecurity, are we willing to follow him there? If Jesus were saying this speech, he'd probably say, you have to hate even your own bank account. Now, many of us probably do hate our bank account, but it's because there's not enough in it, not because there's too much. So Jesus requires us to subordinate our every ambition and allegiance to him. Now, if Jesus' message is what saves people, then why does he make it so difficult? Well, the demands seem excessive when we lose sight of the severity of the problem that he's trying to address. When we treat a medical condition, we know that the cure can't be worse than the disease itself, or why bother? So if I go to the doctor with a cold and the doctor says, yeah, I think 4 courses of chemotherapy would see the back of that cold, I'll probably say, no thanks, doc, I'll let this cold run its natural course because I don't want to get that sick. I've seen people walk through chemo, it's no fun. But if instead the doctor says, you've got cancer, now something as awful as chemo seems an appropriate response because, perishing with cancer is worse still. But I can't negotiate with the doctor. If he says that 4 courses of chemotherapy is what is medically necessary to deliver me from this horrible cancer, I can't say, yeah, but chemo is awful, I'll give you 2 instead of 4. If I do that, if I go halfway, then I'm going to end up in the worst of both worlds. I'm going to lose my hair and feel sick and tired all the time, but I'll still have cancer. And so it is spiritually. Jesus says this difficult way is the way that we deal with the spiritual problem that is killing you. And if we say, Jesus, I'm willing to go with you, but only so far. I'm willing to give you stuff, but only so much. Then I'm experiencing the worst of both worlds because I'm giving some things that are valuable to me to Jesus, exposing myself, and that, especially in that context, to the potential of suffering and loss, but at the same time, I'm not getting the reward that Jesus so desperately wants to give to me. Jesus prescribes a difficult treatment because sin is fatally serious. Now, how are Jesus' demands, stringent as they are, good news? Well, while the costs of following Jesus are high, the promised benefits are far, far higher still. When we trust Jesus, when we lay down our life for him, he begins to heal us from the corrosive effects of sin in our lives. Your life is messed up because of sin. Some of that sin is your sin. Some of that sin is other people's sin, but you're still suffering the consequences of it. God promises us that when we yield ourselves to him, he begins to work to undo it. Now, I don't want to set up wrong expectations here. He doesn't magically snap his fingers and make the bad stuff go away. He works to us to gradually heal us and change us so that we become more like Jesus. He can even use the bad stuff. Now, I don't believe that God wills bad stuff on his people. I believe that God has given free will to people. And so we choose to behave in ways that are hurtful to other people. But in spite of the fact that things happen to us that aren't God's perfect will, God can still use those things to transform us to become like Jesus. So when someone mistreats me, God says, I really didn't want you to go through that. It isn't my will, but if you want to become like Jesus, you have to learn how to really love. And you don't really know how to love until you learn how to love a person who doesn't love you back. A person who hates you, in fact. So I can use this experience, as awful as it is, to transform you, to give you the kind of life, to work in you the kind of life that I want you to have. Or maybe your health fails you. And Jesus says, I didn't want you to go through this. But when we lose our own strength, we have the opportunity to learn from God what it is to have our hope in him. And so as you walk through this, I will transform your heart. I will transform your hope. And so God works to address these different areas of our life to undermine the different forces that try to destroy us spiritually. Anxiety, anger, addiction, unforgiveness, guilt, fear, alienation. Jesus works in us to end them. And of course, all of this is simply a down payment on what is to come. That God promises us that in the age to come, we will live in perfect harmony and belonging with each other. And we will know God and be known by God. That we will all belong together. And that our deepest desires and even more will be fulfilled in us. But the process that we walk through is often not easy. It often requires difficulties. But the rewards are far more consequential than the sacrifices. The Apostle Paul, who knew more than almost anyone about the sacrifices of following Jesus, reflected on his life of sacrificial service. And he told the Corinthians that though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long. Yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. Yes, God asks much, but the rewards are great. If Jesus lowered his demands on us, he would also have to lower the expectations that we could expect of him. Paul talks about an eternal weight of glory. Let's desire that kind of glory. It's when we lose sight of God's glory, you see, that discipleship can seem too hard. So let's pray for a renewed vision of God's glory in order to sustain us. So that when Jesus puts an ad in the paper that says people needed for a job, long hours, disrespect, danger, possibility that it ends in death, but great reward to the one who perseveres, that my natural response is, Lord, sign me up.